Hey everyone, welcome back. Okay, this weapon is just stupid. I'm gonna open this up by saying, just grab this weapon. This week's offerings include two notable Incarnon guns, the Strun and the Latron. The Strun basically performs like a miniature Tenet Tetra alt-fire, similar aesthetic with all the particle flare, but it's Tenet Tetra AoE at home. Less damage, less AoE, less crits, etc. On the bright side, it has a very large Incarnon magazine. You get a spray and pray miniature AoE launcher. If you like that, feel free to pick it up. It's like giving the Tenet Tetra the Opticore Vandal treatment. To acquire these new Incarnon weapon upgrades, you need to complete the Duviri quest. Then, if you have Steel Path unlocked, you need to pick two of the weapons on rotation to work towards on the Steel Path circuit mode. Clearing rounds gives points to point tiers. Reach the appropriate point tier and return to the screen to claim your loot. The Incarnon Genesis adapters have a rotating 6-week schedule with the full details in this video's description. If you do not get the adapter for your weapon before weekly reset, it will not reappear for 6 weeks. If you get the adapter, you can use on your appropriate weapon at Cavallero and the Chrysalith whenever you want. Keep in mind, attaching the adapter requires Duviri open world materials, and has unlock requirements on the Incarnon tree perks just like the original Incarnon weapons from the Angels update last year as well. The Latron Incarnon. You know in Trumna's alt-fire, the bouncy grenades. You shoot Trumna's single bouncy grenades from the alt-fire. Except, here's the thing. The Latron Incarnon perks make it the only gun in the game that can armor strip by shooting. Yes, this thing strips armor, AoE, DPS, and applies burns all at once with no support. There are many ways to play this weapon, and I'm going to show you 4 separate setups today. Starting with the most basic traditional rifle setup to the more wild setups Latron Incarnon can now pull off. Is this weapon going to become meta? Absolutely. I doubt it will dethrone anything, but it will sit pretty at the top alongside the other options. We're using Latron Prime instead of Latron Wraith. The Prime has much higher puncture weight, meaning higher chance of armor strip procs. It also has higher status chance. Armor strip is always a bigger damage boost than whatever damage scaling a weapon has. Since Latron Prime has nearly double status and much higher puncture weight, it will strip much faster than the Latron Wraith. It also has 1.5 times higher base damage. It's a very easy choice. Let's look at the Incarnon perk options. All second generation Incarnons only have 4 perk trees instead of 5. The first perk is the same as all Incarnon weapons. You shoot heads to build meter, alt-fire to transform. That's it. Reload speed affects this animation. Alt-firing in Incarnon form reverts to normal and removes all charge remaining in the bar. The second perk adds some innate damage to the weapon. This directly adds into the value everything is calculated off of and is a very common perk on all second generation Incarnons. The other effect is deciding between a weak gun CO bonus or more multi-shot. Because Latron's niches being the only gun in the game that can strip armor, our fastest way of boosting damage is ripping all the armor off ASAP. Therefore, we take the multi-shot buff here. Enemies die instantly from Latron when full stripped, therefore stripping faster is more important than boosting our damage. The third perk offers minus zoom, extra 15 magazine capacity, and minus 60% recoil. The minus zoom is useless today. It really isn't needed because the Incarnon doesn't need to zoom and minus recoil is enough for the non-Incarnon form. Basically, if you use Incarnon DPS build plus magazine to make spamming shots to stack the Incarnon bar easier. If you're using non-Incarnon DPS build, yes there is a use for this, then consider minus recoil to make sure you can comfortably land those headshots. The fourth perk is the big one. We have headshot damage bonus. I would never ever recommend this. Why? Because the right crit perk already doubles your base crit chance. Yes, base. And adds some crit multiplier. This applies to all shots including body shots, and even on the Incarnon form, you're not aiming at the head anyways. The headshot perk doubles headshot damage and only affects headshots obviously. For almost every build today, we will be using the leftmost armor strip perk. I will always tell you when we use a different perk, so keep that in mind. Each puncture proc strips 20% armor from an enemy. Multi-shot also affects this. Latron is the main puncture weight. Both the non-Incarnon and an Incarnon AoE do puncture damage and can strip well. For funny synergies, this is the second best weapon for Meg currently. The Incarnon form has Ricochet shots and has no limit. It only ends when it runs out of projectile lifespan distance. Unlike other projectile nukes, the shot explodes every single time it contacts something, be it the floor or the enemy, etc. This is important because while it cannot directly hit an enemy more than once, the AoE can, and hitting 20 enemies in Meg's bubble makes it explode many times. This causes a similar effect to Tenet Arcaplasm, whereas multi-hit on the same enemy, albeit weaker. Since Latron strips armor on puncture procs and the AoE does puncture, the extra hits in Meg's bubble can instantly strip all armor off and burn everything to death, because the other 50% of the AoE is pure heat. Other frames can simulate this with Zada's Whisper plus Ensnare, which is basically Magnetize at Home. But wait, there's more. You don't actually need Zada's Whisper. Enemy bodies are top heavy in Warframe. This means their legs are more narrow than their upper body. Ensnaring enemies together creates a solid layer of touching bodies above the waist but leaves a gap in the legs. If you ensnare a group and shoot the Latron Incarnon underneath their legs, it gets stuck in their crotch area and constantly bounces up and down on the floor. This results in many extra hits and often instantly strips all armor off while also applying a ton of heat stacks to burn them to death instantly. This allows you to get the Magnetizes effect without needing the traditional Zada's Whisper plus Ensnare, and is only doable because Latron explodes on every rebound. This also enables two very different Incarnon playstyles. A run-and-gun spray-and-play nuke build that blinds your screen and ricochets everywhere, and a slower, paced, methodical group DPS build that has extremely good Incarnon ammo economy and lets you fight at your own pace. Both the run-and-gun and slow-play Incarnon builds today have over 120 KPM. Double tap. This one is simple. Double tap affects the non-Incarnon form. It does not affect the Incarnon form. Activating Incarnon form freezes double tap's remaining timer. Exiting Incarnon form will make double tap count down again. You retain the current state of double tap buffs on your non-Incarnon damage when you exit Incarnon. Therefore, double tap is useless on all Incarnon DPS builds today despite being an external final multiplicative buff. Zephyr. Shooting a tornado directly prevents the weapon from ricocheting and removes most of the extra hit scaling Latron has. It still works well, but loses most of its shine and becomes no different than other good Zephyr weapon choices. Ricocheting the shot off the floor into the tornado does bonus damage, but is difficult to pull off consistently and I would not recommend. Okay, builds time. Traditional rifle build first. This is strongly recommended to be used with Ensnare. 1. You're well open to fire when shooting one enemy at a time. 2. Punch through is much more effective against crowds to improve KPM. 3. It is much easier to hit heads when they're all close together. This setup reaches roughly 80 to 90 KPM and is a good reference point to the crazy things we can do later today. You can use the Incarnon form if you want, but this is an old school point and click. Stabilizer is important in the XLS to cut back on recoil. If you want to run viral Hunter munitions instead of corrosive, you would drop Galvanize Aptitude for Hunter munitions, and change the elements to viral. Prime Shred because Non-Incarnon is a semi-auto single target rifle. Double tap is a final damage multiplier and is much easier to upkeep with grouping. Stack building is also affected by multi-shot and punch through as well. You get up to a plus 400% final damage bonus, letting you clean off the crowd easily. It resets if you miss or 2 seconds pass without landing a hit. Despite being a headshot build, I would still recommend Merciless unless you use a reload speed frame, since the base reload speed of Latron Prime is 2.4 seconds. For our abnormal build setups today, our first is a Demolyst killing build. This works whether in Incarnon mode or not. Take extended volley no matter what, since you do not want to reload while setting up against a Demolyst. Use Stabilizer and Excellus to counter the recoil. The only difference is replacing double tap with Quality of Life Prime Fast Hand, since that affects the transformation animation. Galvanize Aptitude helps strip armor faster and lets you kill even without Incarnon. Keep in mind it does not buff the damage of the Incarnon AoE, which is 2/3 of the Incarnon damage. Alternatively, but subpar options are Galvanized Scope for red crits, which has a low buff duration, or Thermite rounds. Thermite rounds scales better for endurance, where you can stack up more and stronger heat procs so that by the time the armor is gone, they burn to death a lot faster. Primed Bane is important to boost our damage, but also double dips the heat dots if you use the Incarnon mode for 2.4 times more damage. Hammershot both boosts our crit damage and more status to proc more puncture for armor strip. We use a pure IPS build outside of the endurance situation because armor strip speed is dependent on puncture weighting of the weapon. Therefore, modding more elements slows down the armor strip speed. Against Demolyst, you'd probably bring a pistol to prime it anyway, such as Epitaph, Nucor, or Compressor. It does not matter what you use as long as it applies viral. That's why we don't need viral on this Latron build. The damage is already high enough and skyrockets with viral stacks. The flesh type bonus of actual viral damage itself on Latron is unneeded. Merciless is still recommended because reload speed sucks, but if you can get around that, I would recommend Deadhead. You find a Demolyst, proc Magus Lockdown, prime it with your pistol and spam headshots with Latron, Incarnon or not. The Demolyst should die in about 2 seconds of shooting. If you bring Zada's Whisper, then they can probably die in literally 2 or 3 shots. Our third build today is a run and gun dopamine shot Incarnon DPS build for survival. It has at least 120 kpm and looks like the oversized emergence dissipate particles everywhere. Your goal is to charge the Incarnon meter as fast as possible, transform it, and run headfirst into enemies spraying ricocheting explosive shots everywhere. Stabilizer is recommended for this build since we are not using Ensnare to line up shots more easily when charging the Incarnon meter. It's incredibly fun to play, just keep in mind you do have to restack the Incarnon meter when it empties. Gun CO does not affect the AoE, and because we're going raw damage DPS, we don't care about the armor strip for build 3. This means we run Amalgam Serration in the 8th slot to buff the weapon AoE, I just have polarity problems. And it also gives bonus sprint speed. Alternatively, you can slot Prime Fast Hands for faster Incarnon transformation. You will also want to swap the critical parallel Incarnon perk on the 4th tree to massively buff our raw crits. This is because we don't care about armor strip. This buffs us to 200 plus CC for only oranges. Aiming carefully is not that important, so we take extended volley again for spamming non-Incarnon shots quickly when building our meter. The second perk tree remains the same. You are spamming enough AoE that puncture procs will still happen here and there to keep the multi-shot buff active. The other buff only increases direct damage, which is useless for the Latron Incarnon AoE, which makes up 2/3 of the Incarnon damage. Our typing is on corrosive since we also have a high status and can strip partial armor of anything that survives. Primed Bane is mainly a 1.55 times multiplier on this build since most of our damage is coming from corrosive and not our heat procs. Prime Shred is still useful for building Incarnon meter quickly since you will be draining it very fast on this build. You can also play slower too if you want, but then I also got one last interesting build to show you. The final 4th build is a maximum ammo efficiency setup that takes advantage of ricocheting physics with infinite scaling. We take advantage of puncture full strip and infinite scaling P-procs to kill enemies off. Remember how I showcased that the Latron Incarnon shot explodes on every ricochet and can get stuck underneath enemy crotches with Ensnare? That's the crux of this build. Crowd control, armor strip, scaling damage all in one go. And you barely ever have to build the Incarnon meter since 1 to 2 shots is enough to kill 10 to 20 enemies instantly. Recoil is irrelevant on this build since you barely need to build the Incarnon meter and you also have Ensnare to line up the headshots. This means you can take the plus 15 magazine perk on the 3rd tree, make sure using the flensing spikes on the 4th tree for puncture procs to armor strip, and riddled target for bonus multi-shot and strip even faster on the 2nd tree. Stabilizer is optional on this build because enemies are ensnared for Incarnon meter building and the majority of our damage comes from Incarnon mode, not shooting heads. This build is the most chill and relaxing setup and most suitable for those that want a more methodical playstyle with Latron Primes Incarnon. You shoot the floor to kill enemies. Armor strip is extremely important on this build, so our puncture weight must be preserved. There are 0 elemental mods, keeping the 50% heat, 50% puncture ratio on the AoE. Gun CO is still used since we need status chance to speed up the armor strip, while also buffing our non-Incarnon shots if you need to use it. A 0 element build also opens up a slot for Prime Fast Hands as well as Hammer Shot. Prime Fast Hands speeds up the Incarnon transformation animation, and Hammer Shot both buffs our burns and stronger crits. This build I strongly recommend Merciless, since almost all the Incarnon kills will come from shooting the floor to ricochet shots up into enemy backsides. This is also the exact same build you would use for Meg, since getting trapped in Magnetize has a very similar effect as shooting the floor to bounce up into ensnared targets. Magnetize causes significantly more hits, and a single shot from Meg is typically enough to kill any level, even into Endurance. This is the second coming of Tenet Archiplasmor for her. Here's to a great revival of the Latron Prime era. The Incarnon Genesis perk tree is strong enough that both Latron, Wraith, and Prime will absolutely destroy, though I would recommend picking up the Prime instead. It's just better in every way and the Wraith doesn't have any special niche to bring to the table this time. Whether you're using Latron as a traditional single-shot rifle, a Demolyst killing machine, a run-and-gun blind corrosive nuke, or a methodical burn DPS with infinite scaling, there is a playstyle for everyone. Next up, the Furax Wraith Incarnon tomorrow. See you there. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. 79.5% of you are not subscribed. I'm trying my best to get you new information out always as soon as possible, like I've been doing with the Duviri update. Stick around if you want to see interesting memes and builds on a nearly daily basis. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.